we said we'd do a preparation class for Yutes Kislev, Bezrat Hashem. So that's the plan. And also we had a request, so we'll say something general, a vort from the beginning of Tanya. We've studied Tanya before, I think, in this forum. So many of the women here, I think we studied, I don't know if we studied all the chapters, but we studied the first chapters, if I recall. The first topic in Tanya, as everybody knows, is the different characters of the book, or called the characters in Chazal, the Tzaddik, the Rasha, and the Beinini. So the book starts by depicting, or actually asking all sorts of questions, different kushiyot on the what you'd say the popular categorization, which most of us usually the way the world thinks of these characters that are mentioned in Chazal. So Chazal are full of mentions about tzaddikim, rashaim, different types of tzaddikim. As we explained once before, the simple structure is three different characters: a tzaddik, a rasha, and a beinini. Which, as we'll explain today, if you put your mind to it, so be'emet, it's again definitely before you study Tanya, maybe even after you study Tanya, if you're not really not catching the point so well, that it's not so clear why there are three. Maybe there are actually only two characters, like a tzaddik and a rasha. Because also the Beinini, definitely before the Alter Rebbe wrote his book, nobody really stressed the difference or the understanding of who this Beinini is. So really, you could say that either you're a tzaddik or you're a rasha. Even like it says in Rosh Hashanah, Kodesh Baruch Hu has three books. So this is in the Mishnah already. That Kodesh Baruch Hu, either you're subscribed in the book of tzaddikim, or of rashaim, or of beinoni. What's the simple meaning of being in a book of beinoni? That you're on hold until Yom Kippur. It's not an existing state of being. It's just like an in-between gray place. So we could say even more than that. We could say that the original structure is only two. And already saying three, tzaddik, rasha, and beinoni, that's already a chidush a little bit. There's already something new in that approach. But our sages don't let it stay at that. They actually break these three characters into five. So this is part of what the Alter Rebbe quotes a lot in the beginning of Tanya. That already in our sages' sources, in the Gemara and the Zohar, you can see that there are actually two types of tzaddikim and two types of rashaim, and then you get five different characters. Where the Alter Rebbe himself, we explained this when we studied. This is a very important topic in studying Tanya, this understanding that the Alter Rebbe himself, in of explaining the Beinoni, he actually splits the Beinoni himself into three different characters, and then you get seven different characters. So this is the most basic structure of the beginning of Tanya. And so we have a book coming out only about this, just explaining these characters. And I think if I recall correctly, we studied this before. Now, we'll say a point, maybe we've discussed this in different angles, I don't remember, but we'll say a point that's very general and very important here of how to see this Beinoni. In the beginning of Tanya, so the Alter Rebbe, he asks a lot of questions. And basically what he proves is that it's a perplexing topic. He shows how the simple understanding of seeing anybody who does more good than bad is a tzaddik, anybody who does chas v'shalom the opposite is a rasha, and if you're half, you're a beinoni, it doesn't work. He surfaces several contradictions or seeming contradictions in the sources, in our sages' expressions, in the Torah, in the halacha, and he proves very well that's a misconception. You can't catch it that way. He doesn't explain in chapter 1 at all what you do understand. He just explains what can't be understood. Now, also this point we explained before. That this is the understanding the chapter 1, the way we mentioned now is very important. We won't dwell on that right now. When studying within the next exactly you split the time, it's a person much deeper than a superficial understanding of his behavior. And by doing that, he can then spread a categorization which will answer all the questions he asked in chapter 1. That's the order of Tanya. We've explained this many times before. Now, so what you get in the beginning of the book is you get a lot of introductions, questions and introductions, and the answers only start from chapter 10 henceforth. Now, the Alter Rebbe called Tanya Sefer Shel Beinini, as we know. That the word Tanya is the first word of the book, and that's become the most popular name of the title of the book. But the Alter Rebbe named the book, when he published it, he named the book Sefer Shel Beinoni, the book of Beinoni. Anybody who studies Tanya immediately becomes acquainted with this character, this seemingly new character, even though, as we said, it's mentioned in Chazal, but it's not elaborated on, and it was never conceived of, the Beinoni was never conceived as a very important character. Adrabah, you should be a tzaddik, and don't be a rasha. And probably on the way, you'll go in between the Beinoni, but it was just conceived as a go-between. And the Alter Rebbe, he stresses the exact opposite, as we'll explain today. Really, what the Alter Rebbe wants to say is that everybody has to be a Beinoni. Or even tzaddikim, even Rishonim. If you're not phrased in Tanya, is that Beinoni hi midat kol the sizing of every person in the world. Every person in the world needs to be a Beinoni. We like very much quoting the Alter Rebbe himself. Also, the Alter Rebbe, he quotes Rabbi from the Talmud at the beginning of the book. And all the tzaddikim are like this. They all testified upon themselves that they're all Beinoni. Also, the Alter Rebbe himself said about himself that he's kegon ana Beinoni. I myself am a Beinoni. A very important quotation from a book called Ramach Otiyot. Ramach Otiyot is very spicy Chabad sayings that were put together. It was even this pamphlet was kept secret for many years because there are very harsh statements there. One of the stories there was collected by Reb Shmuel Gronim Asterman, who was the first mashpia in Tonkat in the time of the Rebbe Rashab. And he collected sayings that he had heard from the greatest Hasidim of the previous generation. This is going back to Reb Hilmi Parich, Mom is the greatest greats. One of the stories there is that the Alter Rebbe said once in front of one of his Hasidim that he himself is a Beinoni. And that Chassid heard that, so he said, "No, I'm also not a Rasha. The Rebbe is much higher than me. And if you say you're only a Beinoni, so you're saying I'm a Rasha." But he knew this Chassid was a big Chassid. He knew he's not a Rasha either. So the Rebbe answered that there are 500 madregas of Beinoni. That was the phrase he said. 500 is like infinity. It's like a world. That's the phrase he said. Beinoni is olam mali. It's an entire world. The world has 500 tafkufama. It's 500 steps. That's also a generalization, because if you want, you could say there are infinite steps. So the Beinoni is the entire reality. Everybody needs to be a Beinoni. Now, without explaining, we don't have time today, and a lot of us have studied this before. We'll say something general about this Beinoni again. Just the fact, just the concept of stressing this character, highlighting this character. And before we go into all of the ins and outs of Tanya and how he describes it, we were saying that Bichlal, a person's nature is to think in two poles. And the word we want to say is that the first, or maybe the foremost, the most basic chidush of Tanya is just the necessity of highlighting a sentence. Just that in every case, I was starting to say before that this is a very therapeutic word. Mamish, you could translate this almost into any situation that balancing any constellation is dependent on the word in the Zohar. The phrase for this is called matkala. Matkala means the lip of the scale. Defining a well-defined center, highlighting a center. Again, not just a hypothetical center, because every 2 points have a hypothetical center. But a well-defined atzmi, madriga atzmi, like in Kabbalah, the center line, chesed, gvur, tiferes. So tiferes, it's not just the gray between chesed and gvur. It's something in of itself. So much so that inherent center, that true center, actually goes higher. It contains like the containment of the paradoxical edges both at once, and therefore it even soars higher than each edge that it contains. It capacitates both poles. So its own inherent trait is even higher, and therefore it can tolerate two paradoxical contradicting poles, as we'll explain. This is the Beinini of the Tanya. So we started to say that if we just translate this into very simple phrases, so what's an unbalanced? This is what we'd call balance. So very much in a sense, what we want to say today is a word. What do we mean when we say balance? Like this could be a first class in Chassidus, a first class in Torah Nefesh. Okay, when we say a person comes into the school of Torah Nefesh, okay, I want to be healthy. We want people to be mentally healthy. What does it mean to be mentally healthy? What does it look like? What's the archetype? So the Beinini, that is the archetype of what it means to be mentally healthy. Now again, if you study Tanya, you'll see that this Beinini is a very archetype character. He's not anything specific. Yeah? So it could be an infinite multitude of personalities. It's not trying to put anybody into a stereotypic mold at all. But it's a archetype of how to balance a system, any system, especially a mental system, your own soul. So if I were to just say this word balance, again, like everything, like we mentioned, every typical intuitive thought is usually upside down. Itapcha, 180 degrees wrong. So if I just think of balance, what's my image of balance? So if a person has like very drastic mood swings, maybe even clinical mood swings, like manic depression or something, and that's not balanced. One day you wake up and you're in lights, you want to conquer the world, you're going to be the Mashiach, I don't know what you're going to do, you feel like you can gobble up reality. But the next day, or even the next 10 minutes later, you feel like if you can drag yourself out of bed, that's going to be a miracle. Now that example I just said now, that's not even clinical. That's just standard mood swings. Everybody has that. That's not even. You don't even need treatment that way. You're just normal. So if it gets more drastic than that, then maybe it could be radical. But just waking up one day and thinking you're the Mashiach, and the next day thinking you're a donkey, no, that's normal. But this normality of life, that you go through a lot of swings, edges, and your personality, your soul, like we said, encompasses poles. You have very high poles, you have peaks, and you have lows. Very high peaks and very low lows. Now the what's the breaking here? The breaking, it says in Kabbalah that what breaks is the vessels. Now these are phrases I know we've explained before. I don't know exactly in which context or which examples we used, but if I were to translate here, what's vessels and what's lights? And the phrase in the Ari is that in the breaking of the world of chaos, the vessels break, and therefore the lights return to their root. Mistalkim, like it's like a person gets his energy or his motivation, his chayus is sucked inwards. You swallow yourself back in. your life, your light. When your vessels break. So what's your vessel? So again, we'll just say that we'll phrase it as if a person. Maybe we'll use an example we use often to explain this. It'll be a bit better. The simplest example for chaos and rectification is like we've said this many times. And this is the Alter Rebbe says this in a mimer explicitly, that chaos is youth. Youth is typically chaotic, and just like in Kabbalah, like the older worlds, the worlds which were the past worlds, are the worlds of chaos. They broke. And the current world, like the present time, it's called rectification, which doesn't mean it's a rectified state, but it's, as we'll explain, it's rectifiable. So if I translate this very superficially to a person's life, then your past is chaos and your present is relatively rectification. If we'd be a little bit more precise, it's not just your chronological past. It's as we've explained before, it's your current past. It's like the residue, the trauma of your past, which exists right now. Just like in Kabbalah, the worlds of chaos, it's not something that happened once upon a time. It's happening right now in the background of reality. And this is also how these states of minds are phrased. These terms are very popular today because the Rebbe used these terms very often. Not very often, but in his final sichas, the Rebbe phrase that we need to do things orot de tohu bekelim de tikun. It's a very famous phrase by the Rebbe. So what the Rebbe did is he concocted actually two phrases in Kabbalah, where tohu was chaos, and the phrase for chaos is that there are chaotic lights, great lights, but very immature small vessels. How would we depict this in our psychological examples? So it's like we said, it's childhood. So a child is someone who has a lot of motivation, a lot of aspiration, will, strong lights. Lights is like energy, drive. He has a strong drive. But that drive is being funneled into very, very narrow scenarios. Like he wants something. I want candy, and he wants that candy, and he wants it very much, but he only wants that candy. So it's a lot of energy, a lot of drive being packed into a very narrow, immature vessel. What I want is very unflexible, and how much I want it is very, very strong. Now this, as you can immediately understand, is a very, very fragile state of mind. Because like a child, if you don't get what you want, then there's going to be shvirat hakelim. You have a tantrum. There's a trauma. Everything smashes into smithereens. And what breaks, again, this is a good example of what we're explaining, the scenario breaks. The vessels are like the scenario into which you're funneling your lights. That's a typical state of mind of chaos, a chaotic state of mind, which is breaking. It's going to break sooner or later. Now, in the world of rectification is like fixing, treating psychologically this trauma. So the recuperation from such a breaking, that relatively would be a rectified state. Relative. Again, as the second we parallel this to a time span, so obviously it's very relative because like right now is rectification relatively to yesterday, but today is going to be chaotic relatively to tomorrow. So it's an ongoing process. Just like in Kabbalah, there are many worlds that are created and break. Nonetheless, relatively, the recuperated state is typically the opposite, where there are very mature, relatively mature, broad vessels, and very or subdued lights. So if a person was in a very chaotic state of mind, he was going for something very specific in life. He was going to be, I don't know, he was going to be a pilot. And that was his only option. His father was a pilot, and his mother was a pilot, and his grandfather was a pilot. Everybody's pilots. And this is what he's going to be. And then he doesn't get accepted to flight school. So it shatters and breaks. And again, the scenario breaks and the lights get sucked back in. So he loses all motivation. He dies. That's the phrase in Chassidus, in Kabbalah, that he dies. So hopefully he doesn't completely die, but he breaks. And if you recuperate him, then the second state of mind is the opposite. You come to this person now and you ask him, what do you want to do in life? So suddenly he's very flexible on his scenario. I don't know, maybe I'll be a train driver, maybe I'll be a bus driver, maybe I'll be a taxi driver. Before he was very, very only a pilot. But when it recuperates, the vessels broaden. Every break broadens your vessels. But simultaneously, it also diminishes your lights. Your ability to funnel a very strong drive into these new scenarios is diminished. So again, a juvenile state of mind is chaotic, and it's typically full of lights, very strong drive being funneled into very narrow scenarios, vessels. And that breaks. And the breaking itself causes a broadening of the vessels. You become more flexible in your scenarios, but you lose a lot of your lights. So you're much less devoted. So this sort of process is like the Kabbalistic definition of growing old, where you go from a state of mind which had a lot of aspirations and lights, and slowly but surely, maybe we'll be a little bit more specific. First of all, the example I just brought about scenario, that's not very precise. If you want to be more precise, would say the vessels aren't the external scenario. It's not being a driver or being a pilot. It's your identification with the scenario. Like your personal, it's part of your soul, just like in Kabbalah. The lights and the vessels are part of one entity. So again, like the first example we mentioned, the person has mood swings. So when you wake up in the morning and you feel very, very high, you feel you're a tzaddik, you're the Mashiach, then you identify with that notion immediately. That identification, where you build up a sense of self, you categorize yourself in light of your high, then your categorization is your vessels. And then when you fall from that high, and you find yourself in a very lowly low, where you suddenly feel that you're worthless, then again your image of self shatters. I thought it was a great tzaddik, but no, now I wake up and I realize that was a delusion. The breaking is the feeling of being delusioned or being disillusioned. That every mood swing in life involves a shattering of a newly acquired image of self. And when I was high, I thought I was a tzaddik, and I immediately adopted that image for myself. And then when I fall, I think I'm the worst Russia in the world, and I also adopt that image immediately. And there's like a sense of shattering, like myself breaks with every swing. When you're asking, you're muted though, so I can't hear you. You need to unmute.
So what you're describing now about the shattering of the vessels, which chapter of Tanya is this in?
It's not yet. I mean, this is all an introduction, just to explain what the Alter Rebbe wants to say by highlighting the Beinini.
Okay.
In the beginning of the book.
Okay.
Again, so what causes the trauma? And this is what we wanted to pinpoint in all of this discussion. Where is this in Tanya? This is the first sentence in Tanya, if you want to translate it in Tanya. The first sentence in Tanya, he says that he quotes two quotations from Chazal. One saying a person should hold himself as a Rasha, and one quotation saying you should never think you're a Rasha. And then he asks this very question: that how am I going to cope with this? How am I supposed? Should I be high or should I be low? Should I keep thinking I'm a Rasha, but if I do that, maybe I'll be depressed? Or should I think I'm not a Rasha? Maybe I'm a tzaddik. But if I neglect all my flaws and decide I'm perfect, then yavoli de kalut, you're neglecting your flaws. This is the first question in Tanya. Before he starts asking like scholar questions about different contradicting sources in the Talmud or in the Zohar, before he even starts with that, he first starts with an explicitly psychological question. Like the first question of Tanya is a completely human, emotional question. How am I going to get through life? Should I think I'm a tzaddik? Should I be depressed? Should I be happy? How am I going to take life? That's the first question in time. The way he depicts it is exactly the way we're depicting it now. That a person is accustomed to these mood swings. That sometimes I think I'm on a high, I'm a tzaddik, and sometimes I discover I'm a Rasha. Again, the next day again, I feel much better, and I again rediscover myself as a tzaddik. Now, in our description, we want to pinpoint the breaking. There's a trauma. Every go-between, every time you swing, your image, your newly acquainted identity, which you built up in light of your mood swing, breaks. There's like a sensation of waking up. It was as if, I was misleaded by myself again. I was taken again by I innocently believed I was a tzaddik. And then I break, and I realize I'm a Rasha. And I decide that what was before was a lie. And then again, the next day, I'm again happy, and I see my depression as a lie. There's like a sting in between. The sting between mood swings is the breaking of the image of the identification with the image. That's called the vessels. Like I settle myself in this image. That's called a light in a vessel. And I see myself this way. Every time I do good, I think I'm a tzaddik. That identification breaks and it stings. It scars me every time. Now, because there's like this traumatic experience swinging from side to side in life, that's why intuitively a person tends to iron out the edges as he goes along in life and to slowly but surely adopt a much, much smaller gvulot gizra, to maintain a very, very a very, very gray area in life. Like not to go too high and not to go too low. So again, when you're young and you're inexperienced in this trauma, then you aspire very high. You want to be a cowboy or an astronaut or whatnot. But as long as you go on with life, every aspiration breaks. And also the breaking, the low, you also wake up from the low. And you slowly but surely, you start contracting into the middle. But again, this middle, it's not a well-defined middle. You're not focusing on a center and going for it. You're just compromising your edges and finding yourself in the middle. So there's no middle here. There's no well-defined center. This is why it happens. And this sort of an intuitive process, which is completely natural. This is called entropy. This is the psychological equivalent of entropy, of everything dwindling into zero energy. Everything's just falling apart. You're dying from the day you were born. So this is the natural course of reality in physics and chemistry and also in psychology. It's not only about yourself. This is also your intuitive reaction to other people. If you see somebody who's very, very high, you feel in your belly a need to calm him down. And if you see someone who's very depressed, your intuitive notion is always to cheer him up. The poles frighten you. And therefore, your entire life becomes a slowly but surely deterioration into a dry, gray middle. So when you were young, you had very high aspirations and you also broke very well. And the older you get, you kind of, it's like in the hospital, they have that beep, 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 beep thing. So that's a person's life. You start very highs and lows, slowly but surely get small until you flatline. That's it, you're done. 70 years, 80 years, 120 years, and you turn off eventually. Your whole life is a process of turning off. Now, why? Because, again, the fear, the deterrent, how do you say it? Deterrent of the edges, like the experience of breaking every time you swing, you start intuitively having, like you fear the edges. You start compromising them. and also in your view of other people. You see young messianic crazy bachrim. They're just you start adopting like a cynical sort of depressed image of on life and keep going with this. You're just gonna die. You turn off. The end just turns off. So this is what the world calls to grow up. It's not growing up, it's just going old. Growing up, what's called hitbagrut or gadlut mochim in Kabbalah, is a completely opposite process. If you open Tanya, you'll see that the Alter Rebbe, he says the exact opposite. When you're depressed,
what mochin? What
like a large, like a phrase of growing up in Hebrew is largening, expanding. Here, growing old, it's the opposite of expanding yourself. It's deteriorating. So this is what the world calls growing old. Obviously, the most radical example for this is like psychiatric treatment or even psychological treatment. If you're too high, we'll give you a pill, bring you down. Too low, we'll give you a pill, bring you up. But you don't need to go as far as psychiatric pills. This is everybody's intuitive notion. You see your kids or your friends, you see somebody too high, you immediately feel a need to calm him down. And if you meet somebody too low, then you want to cheer him up. The Alter Rebbe does the exact opposite in Tanya. If you're down, he steps on you. But if you're high, then he challenges you. He wants to stretch your edges. Now, in order to do that, what you need is a center. That's the point I want to make today. That this entire bad process we described is all a result of not being able to identify a center. You only identify the poles. You identify with one of the poles each time. And therefore, there's a traumatic break between every swing. So in light of that, how can we describe or define what does it mean to highlight a center? Highlighting a middle is saying that every person needs to aspire to identify himself in a manner that will contain under the same sense of self, under the same categorization. I need to learn to build an image of self that will explain both my highest highs and lowest lows without needing to compromise my image, without needing to redefine myself. I need to learn how to soar very high without needing to think I'm a tzaddik. And I need to go how to fall very low without needing to think I'm a rasha. This is the Beinini of the Tanya. It's an image of self that will explain to you within one personality how both your highs and your lows don't contradict your vessels, your current understanding of self. And then you can soar very high without that stinging, traumatic experience that you aren't who you thought you were. And you can also fall very low and still maintain the same image of self that you had, if you have an image that contains both poles. This is called the Beinini of the Tanya. The Beinini of the Tanya is understanding your edges as being part of one well-defined character. And when he's very high, he's not a tzaddik. And when he's very low, he's not a rasha. He's always a Beinini. So your sense of self, who you are, your definition of self, doesn't break with your swings. Now, it could very well be that you have to break several times. Again, if you don't have such an image, if you don't have a point of identification, a center point, then you're going to break a lot. Now, the breaking itself, as we explained, will cause a certain compromising of edges. So it could very well be that you have to go through a bit of musar in life until your edges become close enough that you can build up a Beinini. Like if you try to balance, if you try to give a 6-year-old child a very broad balanced image of self, you probably won't manage because, again, his edges are so extreme that it's really very difficult to balance. And therefore, the beginning of life is a lot of breaking. Just like a Kadosh Baruch Hu, he built the world. So it also fell out of his hands 6 or 7 or 8 times. depending how you study it there. He also broke a few times in the world of chaos. So you can't really avoid all breakings, but the point of everything is that once you need to develop a definition of self that explains to you, like we've studied Tanya, so we can say this in context. And we're saying something very, very general. It's true about any study, but since most of the women here have already studied with us Tanya, again, this is what the Alter Rebbe explains about the Beinini, that when he's very, very high in his times of davening, in tefillah, where he's like a tzaddik completely, he can be completely enlightened. Still, it doesn't make him a tzaddik. That's the whole word. You need to know how to narrate the highest highs into being a Beinoni. Even a Beinoni can reach such a high, but he's not a tzaddik, he's a Beinoni. And his Yetzer Hara isn't dead, it's just sleeping. And also the lowest lows, like you can discover the deepest, darkest corners of your soul and still be not surprised and even indifferent. Because that's also a Beinoni. And halevai, I'll stay a Beinoni my whole life, because any ilulei Hashem ozro lo yachol. If Hashem doesn't help me, I know where I belong. Everybody in the world has to build and maintain such an identity. This is the Beinoni of the Tanya. This is the center point of Kabbalah, the middle line. Now, if you do this, once you do this, not only is the aspiration of balance in life not chas v'shalom trying to iron you down to death, chas v'shalom, the opposite. If you have a center, a well-defined center, from that point onwards, you can start recuperating all the compromised edges you've compromised and even stretching them more. So in the later chapters of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, when he gives his actual practical advice, his advice is 180 degrees counterintuitive. When you're down, he tells you to go lower. And when you're high, he tells you to go higher. As long as you have a Beinoni, again, a stable identity, which can explain to you all your edges, from that point onwards, you want to expand. At first, usually, your first expanding is just recuperating what you've compromised before. You need to rebuild your compromised poles. But you don't stop there, you keep going. So true mental health, balance, is nesiyat hafachim. It's the ability to contain, just like the Rebbe's phrase. And this is exactly what the Rebbe phrased. Like when the Rebbe said, maybe the most important sentence the Rebbe said ever, that we need to do things, we need, this is the sikh of koyach nisan, that we need people to come together and concoct a plan. One person or two people, or three people, it doesn't matter, to come together and how to bring Mashiach. And the Rebbe, the only guidelines the Rebbe said is that whatever the plan is, it has to be oiris detoyu, oive bekelim detikun. It has to be chaotic lights in rectified vessels, which is, again, like we said, the concoction of two opposite traits. It's taking the lights of chaos, but funneling them into the broad, mature vessels of rectification. That image is the Beinoni of the Tanya. It's exactly what the Beinoni of the Tanya is. At first, he may be, when I say at first, what I mean at first, practically in life, we usually manage to balance ourselves only once we've gone through compromising. Just like, again, it's not always bad to compromise, to iron out the edges. I'll give a radical example, and then we'll say more normal examples. If a person's truly clinically manic, and he's so mad you can't even discuss anything with him. So pills aren't the solution, but they could definitely enable a solution periodically. So if it's temporary, like if the Beinoni is a Beinoni state, it's an in-between state, then temporarily ironing out the edges isn't always bad. If you need to iron out the edges so that they become capacitatable. But then, once that's done, once you have a center, now you want to go and recuperate and stretch the edges. So again, compromising edges as a system If that's how I'll give a simpler example. If your child falls off the bike and he's crying, so telling him to calm down, that's okay. It's not forbidden to tell a child calm down. But why calm down? Calm down so that I can explain to you about life. People fall off bikes. Now, if you don't calm down and stop crying, I won't be able to explain that. So just saying to a person, calm down, that's okay, even though it's your intuitive trait. But if this is your educational system, how to calm down children, how are we going to have calm children? So that's horrible. That's mamish hepech Torah. It's like Chazal say about the Beinini in the Mishnah. Chazal say midat Beinonit yesh omrim zo midat Sdom. There's a wondrous Mishnah that says that the Beinoni can become Sdom. Sdom is Sdom v'Amorah, like the worst. What does it say about Sdom v'Amorah?
I can't hear you. Stone Amara, say that again, slowly.
The Mishnah in Avos, Pirkei Avos says that if I just say mine is mine and yours is yours, then some people say that that's an intermediate state level. Some people say that's the worst level. So being a Beinoni can become the worst. Sdom, like the city of Sdom.
I got it.
What does it say about Sdom in the Midrash? The most famous Midrash of Sdom, the Gemara says, that if you came to Sdom and you were too tall, then they cut off your feet. And if you were too short, they stretched you. That's Midat Sdom. Like ironing you out. That's called Midat Sdom. If it's something that's you're just in between, like you need to calm someone down in order to stabilize him so that then you can re-expand his personality. Okay. But if it becomes a system, yesh omrim ze midat Sdom. And if your educational theme is how to get children to be calm, children don't need to be calm. Children need to conquer the world. Sometimes you need them to calm down so you can explain that to them. But being calm is never an end. It's always a means towards the end. So again, this is very important concepts of how I understand the Beinoni of Tanya. You could see the Beinoni as something gray, like in between. This is the exact opposite of what the Alter Rebbe wants to explain. He wants to define the Beinoni as a well-defined character. So much so that everybody needs to be a Beinoni. Even a tzaddik needs to be a Beinoni. Being a Beinoni, identifying myself as a Beinoni, is balancing my personality. Once that's done, I can start stretching. Not only will I stop the entropic process of ironing myself out until I die, I'll stretch myself into eternal life. This is Tchiyat HaMetim. This is the Beinoni of the Tanya. This is like maybe the core piece of advice of the book. And if you translate this into any specific scenario, this is mamash a basic class. So every treatment, every therapy is all identifying a well-defined center. The person in front of you is living on two poles, and that's why he's diminishing. But if he understood himself in the center, then not only would he not need to diminish his poles, he'd be able to expand his poles. And that's what we want. That's what the Alter Rebbe wants. He wants you to soar. He wants to stretch you. He wants to make your highs higher and your lows lower. He wants you to rectify the deepest, darkest, horrible places in your soul, and he wants to expose the highest highs. In order to do that, you need a well-defined center. And then you can capacitate all these peaks without losing your sense of self, without breaking, without feeling that that I'm not who I thought I was. You never go through that sensation. No matter how high you go, you never think you're a tzaddik, and no matter how low you're exposed, you're never surprised. So if you have such broad vessels, then from that point onwards, mental health, balance, is the ability to stretch your peaks. The exact opposite of what the world calls balance. What the world calls balance is that you've compromised enough of your peaks to make them tolerable. And that's just growing old. That's not balance. Balance is identifying a pinpoint center which enables you to expand your peaks. That's mental health. That's what we want. But nonetheless, periodically, temporarily, you can go through compromises in order to reach a state which is containable and then stretch it. So there is like an initial Beinini, which is just like a moderate stage. And from that point, you need a true center. Exactly how this thought was developed in Judaism. That at first, Beinoni was conceived of as being an intermediate state. And then the Alter Rebbe comes around and says, but yeah, that's only a temporary view on the Beinoni. The true view on the Beinoni is that it's an essential center. And from that point, you can expose how this Beinoni inter-includes the highest tzaddik and the lowest rasha, all in one character, in one person. Like Chazal say about our greatest tzaddikim, that they inter-include the whole world within their soul, like Adam HaRishon or Moshe Rabbeinu. Their soul inter-includes all of the souls. So that's a Beinoni. That's the Tanya's Beinoni. The Alter Rebbe wants everybody to be that person. So this was a word for the starting, the beginning of Tanya, the beginning of the new cycle of Tanya. We're starting with Hashem on Shabbos.